Can you speak to this realm of ideas, which is fascinating? This battle of big ideas in the 19th century. What are the ideas that were swimming around here?
Yeah. Well, the to describe the 19th century as sort of an age of ideologies is very apt, because Europe is being racked and being put through the ringer of nationalism, demands for self-expression of peoples who earlier have been in empires or under monarchical rule, demands to redraw the map. The tremendous transformations of the Industrial Revolution meant that in the course of about a generation, you would have seen the world around you change in ways that made it entirely unfamiliar. You'd be able to travel across the landscape at speeds that had been unthinkable when you were a child. So it's enormous change and demands for yet more change. And so it's a great mix of ideas, ideologies, the old and the new, religious ideas, religious revivals, as well as demands for secularization. And stepping into all of this are Marx and Engels together in what has been called, I think with justice, one of the most important and influential intellectual partnerships of history. They were very different men. They were both German by origin. Marx had trained as an academic. He had married the daughter of a baron. Because of his radical ideas, he had foreclosed or found himself cut off from a possible academic career and went the route of radical journalism. Engels was very different. Engels was the son of an industrialist, and the family owned factories in Germany and in England. So he was most definitely not a member of the proletariat that he and Marx were celebrating as so significant in their future historical role. There were also huge differences in character between these men. Marx, when people met him, they were astonished by his energy and his dynamism. They also saw him as a man who felt determined to dominate arguments. He wanted to win arguments and was not one to settle for compromise or a middle road. He was disorderly in his personal habits. We might mention, among other things, that he impregnated the family maid and didn't accept responsibility for the child. He was also not inclined to undertake regular employment in order to support his growing family. That's where Engels came in. Engels essentially, from his family fortune and then from his journalism afterwards, supported both himself and the Marx family for decades. And so in a sense, Engels made things happen. In the mysterious way that friendships work, the very differences between these men made them formidable as a dynamic duo, because they balanced off one another's idiosyncrasies and turned what might have been faults into potential strengths. British historian A.J.P. Taylor always has a lovely turn of phrase, even when he's wrong about a historical issue. In this case, he was right. He said that Engels had charm and brilliance. Marx was a genius. And Engels saw himself as definitely the junior partner in this relationship. But here's the paradox. Without Engels, pretty clearly Marx would not have gone on to have the sort of lasting historical impact in the world of ideas that he had.
Just to throw in the mix, there's interesting characters swimming around. So you have Darwin. He has it's difficult to characterize the level of impact he had, even just in the religious context. It challenges our conception of who we are as humans. There's Nietzsche, who's also, hanging around the area. On the Russian side, there's Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to ask, maybe from your perspective, did these people interact in the space of ideas to where this is relevant to our discussion, or is this mostly isolated?
I think that it's a part of a great conversation, right? I think that in their works, they're reacting to one another. I mean, Dostoevsky's thought ranges across the condition of modernity, and he definitely has things to say about industrialization. I think that they react to one another in these oblique ways rather than always being at each other's throats in direct confrontations. And that's what makes the 19th century so compelling as a story, just because of the sheer vitality of the arguments that are taking place in ways big and small.
Well, we should say here, when you mention Karl Marx, maybe the color red comes up for people, and they think the Soviet Union, maybe China, but they don't think Germany necessarily. It's interesting that, I mean, Germany is where communism was supposed to happen.
That's right.
And so can you maybe speak to that tension?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is definitely a factor in the entire history that we're referencing. Marx and Engels never really shed their identity as Germans. Many of their preconceptions, even those traces of nationalism that they had within themselves, even as they were condemning nationalism as a fraud against the working class, clearly their entire formation had been affected by their German background. And it's very true, as you point out, that Germany is intended to be the place where these predictions will play out. I mean, they're also in Britain, also in France, also eventually in the United States. But it's it's Germany by virtue of its central location and then its rapid development later than Britain or France in industrialization, give it this special role in Marx's worldview. And so it's a lasting irony, or a central irony of this whole story, that when a government establishes itself that claims to be following Marx's prescriptions and realizing his vision, it happens in the wreckage of the Russian Empire, a place that did not match the requirements of being industrialized, developed, well on its way in this historical process. And nobody knew this better than the Bolsheviks. Lenin and his colleagues had a keen sense that what they were doing, exciting as it was a gamble. It was a risk because, in fact, the revolution to really take hold had to seize power in Germany. And that's why immediately after taking power, they're not sure they're going to last. Their hope, their promise of salvation is that a workers' revolution will erupt in Germany, defeated Germany, in order to link up with the one that has been launched in this unlikely Russian location, and henceforth, great things will follow that do hew to Marx's historical vision. The last thing to mention about this is that this predominance of Germany in the thinking of Marx had two other reflections. One was that German socialists and later communists organize in order to fulfill Marx's vision, and they produce something that leaves other Westerners in awe in the late 19th century. And that's the building of a strong German workers' movement and a social democratic party. That social democratic party by 1912 is the largest party in German politics by vote. And there's the possibility they might even come to power without needing radical revolution, which, again, also goes against Marx's original vision of the necessity for a revolution. Workers around the world, or rather radical socialists, look with admiration and awe at what the Germans have achieved, and they see themselves as trying to do what the Germans have done. The final point is, growing up during the Cold War, one thought that, well, if you want to represent somebody as being a communist, that person has to have a Russian accent, because Russia, after all, the homeland of this form of government, the Soviet Union, that must be the point of origin. Before the Bolsheviks seized power, in order to really be a serious radical socialist, you needed to read German, because you needed to read Marx, and you needed to read Kautsky, and you needed to read Bernstein and other thinkers in this tradition. And it's only after the Soviet seizure of power that this all changes. So there's lots of marks of that phenomenon.
Which is why the clash between nationalism and communism in Germany. That's such a fascinating aspect of history and all the different trajectories it could take, and we'll talk about it. But if we return to the 19th century, you've said that Marx's chief rival was Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who famously said in 1942, quote, "The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." So what kind of future did Bakunin envision?
Well, Bakunin, in some things, agreed with Marx, and in many others disagreed. He was an anarchist rather than hewing to the sort of scheme of history that Marx was proposing. So he did see humanity as fighting a struggle for a better way of life. He envisioned, as your quote suggests, that revolution and sheer confrontation and overthrow of the existing state of things, not compromise, was going to be the way to get there. But his vision was very different. Rather than organizing conspiratorial and hierarchical political movement, Bakunin envisioned that the ties would be far looser, that both the revolutionary movement and the future state of humanity would grow out of the free association, the anarchist thinking, the free association of individuals who rejected hierarchical thinking in their relations with one another, rejected the state as a form of organized violence, and rejected traditional religious ideas that he saw as buttressing hierarchies. So Bakunin is part of a broader movement of socialists and anarchists who are demanding change and envisioning really fundamental transformation. But his particular anarchist vision steers him into conflict with Marx. And he makes some prophetic remarks about the problems with the system that Marx is proposing. You should add to this that the very fact that Marx is a German by background and Bakunin is Russian kind of adds a further nationalist or element of ethnic difference there. Bakunin warned that a sort of creeping German authoritarianism might insinuate its way into a movement that hewed too closely to having hierarchies in the struggle to overthrow hierarchies. And, his anarchist convictions are not in question here. They led him into conflict with Marx, and Marx railed against him, denounced him, and eventually had him expelled from the International. One of the things, though, that also makes Bakunin so significant is Bakunin is the first in a longer series of approaches between anarchists and communists where they try to make common cause. And you have to say that in every case, it ends badly for the anarchists because the communist vision in particular, especially in its Leninist version, argued for discipline and a tightly organized professional revolutionary movement. The anarchists who sought to make common cause with communists, whether it was in the days of the Russian Revolution or the Russian Civil War, or whether it was then in the Spanish Civil War, the anarchists found themselves targeted by the communists precisely because of their skepticism about what turned out to be an absolutely key element in the Leninist prescription for a successful revolution.
If we can take that tangent a little bit, so I guess anarchists were less organized.
Yes, by definition.
Yeah. Why do you think anarchism hasn't been rigorously tried in the way that communism was? If we just take a complete sort of tangent, I mean, in one sense, we are living in an anarchy today because the nations are in an anarchic state with each other. But why do you think sort of there's not been an anarchist revolution?
Well, I think that probably some anarchists would beg to differ, right? They would see communes in Spain during the Spanish Civil War as an example of trying to put anarchist ideas into place. Bakunin, flitted from one area of unrest to another, hoping to be in on finally the founding of the sort of free communes that he had in mind. Another key point in all of this is that anarchy means something different to different people as a term. And so when you point out quite correctly that, we have an anarchic international situation, that's kind of the Hobbesian model of the war of all against all, where man is a wolf to man. Generally, except if you're talking about nihilists in the Russian revolutionary tradition, anarchists see anarchy as a blessed state, and one where finally people will be freed from the distorting influence of hierarchies, traditional beliefs, subjugation, inequalities. So for them, anarchy, growing out of the liberation of the human being, is seen as a positive good and peaceful. Now, that's at odds with the prescription of someone like Bakunin for how to get there. He sees overthrow as being necessary on the route to that. But, as we point out, it's absolutely key to this entire dynamic that to be an anarchist means that your efforts are not going to be organized the way a disciplined and tightly organized revolutionary movement would be.
Yeah, it's an interesting stretch that a violent revolution will take us to a place of no violence or very little violence. It's a leap.
It's a leap, and it points to a phenomenon that would have enraged Marx and would have been deeply alienating to others in the tradition who followed him, but that so many scholars have commented on, and that's that there is a religious element, not a avowed one, but a kind of hidden religious or secular religious element to Marx's vision, to the tradition that follows Marx. Just think of the correspondences, right? Marx himself as kind of positioning himself as a savior figure, whether that's a Prometheus or a Moses who will lead people to the promised land. The apocalypse or the end times is this final revolution that will usher in a blessed final state, a utopia, which is equivalent to a secular version of heaven. There's the working class playing the role of humanity in its struggle to be redeemed. And scholar after scholar has pointed this out. Reinhold Niebuhr, back in the 1930s, had an article in the Atlantic magazine that talked about the Soviet Union's communism as a religion. Erich Voegelin, a German-American scholar who fled the Nazis and relocated to Louisiana State University and wrote tomes about the new phenomenon of political religions in the modern period. And he saw fascism and Nazism and Soviet communism as bearing the stamp of political religions, meaning ideologies that promised what an earlier age would have understood in religious terms. Voegelin called this the eschaton and said that these end times, the eschaton was being promised in the here and now, being made imminent. And he warned against that, saying the results are likely to be disastrous.
So that's actually a disagreement with this idea that, people sometimes say that the Soviet Union is an example of an atheistic society. So when you have atheism as the primary thing that underpins the society, this is what you get. So that's what you're saying is a kind of rejection of that, saying that there's a strong religious component to a communism.
A hidden component, one that's not officially recognized. I mean, I think that, I had a chance to witness this, actually. When I was a child, my family... I grew up in Chicago to a Lithuanian-American family, and my father, who was a mathematician, got a very rare invitation to travel to Soviet Lithuania, to the University of Vilnius, to meet with colleagues. And at this point, journeys of more than a few days or a week were very rare to the Soviet Union for Americans. And the result was that I had unforgettable experiences visiting the Soviet Union in Brezhnev's day. And among the things I saw there was a museum of atheism that had been established in a church that had been ripped apart from inside and was meant to kind of embody the official stance of atheism. And I remember being baffled by the museum on the inside, because you would expect exhibits, you would expect something dramatic, something that will be compelling, and instead there was some folk art from the countryside showing bygone beliefs. There were some lithographs or engravings of the Spanish Inquisition and its horrors, and that was pretty much it. But as a child, I remember being reproved in that museum for not wearing my windbreaker, but instead carrying it on my arm, which was a very disrespectful thing to do in an official museum of atheism. When I was able to visit the Soviet Union later for a language course in the summer of 1989, one of the obligatory tours that we took was to file reverently past the body of Lenin outside the Kremlin in the mausoleum at Red Square. And communist mummies like those of Lenin, earlier Stalin had been there as well, communist mummies like Mao or Ho Chi Minh, really, I think, speak to a blending of earlier religious sensibility, reverence for relics of great figures, almost saintly figures, so that even what got proclaimed as atheism turned out to be a very demanding faith as well. And I think that's a contradiction that that other scholars have pointed out as well.
Yeah, it's a very complicated sort of discussion. When you remove religion as a big component of a society, whether something like a framing of political ideologies in religious ways is the natural consequence of that.
We hear nature abhorring a vacuum, and I think that there are places in human character that long for transcendental explanations, right? That it's not all meaningless. In fact, there's a larger purpose, and I think it's not a coincidence that such a significant part of resistance to communist regimes has in part come from, on the one hand, religious believers, and on the other hand, from disillusioned true believers in communism who find themselves undergoing an internal experience of revulsion, finding that their ideals have not been followed through on.